before I give the...
I can comment a little bit on your last remark if there's no...
Okay. If there's no, let's collect and then have one round of answers. So there's a question. Please raise your name and affiliation.
Adam Kolisinski at the University of Washington.
And use the microphone.
Adam Kolisinski, University of Washington, Seattle. I have a question for Javier. As I take it in your model, there's no external equity financing either for banks or for firms. And I'm wondering how important that assumption is in your result that increasing capital requirements would cause declining GDP. So if you allowed banks to raise external equity and you allowed firms to raise equity instead of borrowing from banks, wouldn't that effect of increased capital requirements on decreased GDP be mitigated somewhat? So it wouldn't be quite as strong. That's my question.
Let's continue collecting if there are more, and then we have one round of answers to everything by each of the panelists.
So I have two questions. One for David. I wanted to know what was the main determinant of the variance of the changes in exposure, if it's mostly the government exposure or the private. I would imagine potentially the government because that's mostly market-based. And then for Philip and Xin at the same time, so the use of this kind of market-based measure for systemic risk, I can see how they can be volatile. To some extent, the policymaker has a prior that this measure should not move that much. Why not just using the measures as a signal, knowing that there are liquidity issues day to day or week to week, but still using the information that comes from a CDS rather than not using it.
We could take one more if there was demand.
Hi, Greg Nini from University of Pennsylvania. Javier, question for you. I really like the exercise of quantifying the model and taking a stand empirically on what optimal capital requirements might be. So my question is, in your calibration, how do you think about the underlying production process and the ability of banks to affect the systemic risk of firms? I imagine that's really important for quantifying the implications. So just a comment on how you do that calibration.
So I think maybe we start with the answers with, do you have one more? Shall we? Okay, we take this one more and then we go to the answers.
Hi, this is Fabio Nacco from Mediobanca. It's a private investment bank. I'd like to ask you, how do you, an observation on your remarks on Ms. Hung graphic, when you're saying that there is a more risk in the banking sector between the US and Europe. It's probably because it's my idea, it's my hunch, is that it's probably because in Europe there is more risk, systemic risk at the government level than in the US. That's maybe reflected in what you see in the banking sector as a result. What's your comment on that?
Okay, do you want to go ahead first, Javier, maybe, on the theory?
Okay, so thank you. Thank you, Philip, for your comments and nice words. I obviously, I'm not going to complain about your assessment of the contribution of the paper. I also agree on the suggestions for further work. In particular, it will be extremely nice to have a paper that not only talks about what I think we capture, which is the endogenous generation of the threat that we call systemic risk-taking through the risk-taking decisions of the banks, but indeed we miss the why at some point the systemic shock realizes, right? The ideal model will have like an endogenous probability of the systemic shock coming, which actually, thinking a little bit about this, creates a connection with the empirical work that we have seen in the rest of the session. Is in particular, Xin was considering a measure of systemic risk, and I was wondering, is this measure of systemic risk my little x of e in the model, which is the systemic risk-taking? And not necessarily, right? I very much believe that systemic risk-taking was present in the European banking system well before the summer of 2007. So these empirical indicators are more about the manifestation of systemic risk when the proximity of this aggregate shock becomes apparent, right? But the systemic risk-taking is in the background. So it seems to me that the empirical windows upon which we detect systemic risk is potentially too late, is when once it's been taken, it is starting to realize. And then there are factors that drive this up and down, including, by the way, and this is a question to my other colleagues here, including when there is then a development of endogenous beliefs by agents leading into self-fulfilling panic behavior. I don't know how you tackle with that, but I don't want to deviate too much. But of course, this is very much an open research program, and indeed we are dealing with traditional banks. So in our model, the banks are making loans, and then asset pricing considerations are secondary. But I agree that actually Brunemeyer and Sannikov and others have stories that emphasize the role of asset prices, which I think are quite important in a more originate-to-distribute model of banking, or of mega banks that are also sort of investment banks to a large extent. So I agree with those observations about my paper. About the questions, some of them are very specific. I don't know whether I have time to answer. The external equity raising is a very important question. I think in the literature we see various extremes. We see the extreme of Atmati et al. Invoking the validity of the Modigliani-Miller theorem in the context of banking, upon which essentially all discussions should conclude we should just impose a 100% equity requirement to banks, and we will be pretty well with that. Other models take the other extreme and think of, particularly in static analysis, the supply of bank capital is given by whatever the banks have accumulated up to that time. In the middle, I think there is a lack of full understanding by the corporate finance and banking literatures of the true drivers and the true quantitative importance of both the holding cost of equity relative to other sources of funding and the issuance cost or frictional costs associated with raising or paying back to shareholders' capital. I think it's quite frustrating that so many years after the Modigliani-Miller theorem, we still lack those fundamental assessments, and then we have to build on sort of shortcuts. So in this paper, indeed, equity is more costly as a source of funding, essentially because it's treated as the special resource of a class of agents. Now, this class of agents accumulates wealth, which creates a big extension relative to models that simply take an amount of equity as given in the system. Here, the internal dynamics of profits is very important. But indeed, after a crisis, why are not the banks able to recapitalize by just raising fresh equity in huge amounts from the survivors in the economy, the survivors being non-bankers in the logic of the model? And I think this is connected to who are shareholders in the real world. You might say everybody, but I actually doubt, right? We have this micro-evidence that only a small fraction of households invest directly into equities. And maybe without going too much into that, I think that we don't understand fully yet issues of corporate governance. And at some point, I developed this view that outside shareholders will be quite as skeptical to contribute equity to banks if the managers of the banks are not matching their own contribution of equity to the bank to what the outsiders are contributing. Because essentially, an outside equity holder at the bank could be fully expropriated by a negligent manager unless the negligent manager has clearly aligned incentives with those of the outside shareholders. So actually, also in a reduced form or alluding to some other papers, Gerler, Kiyotaki, and Keralto, in a forthcoming Journal of Monetary Economics paper, in a framework very similar to ours in terms of the dynamic of equity, allow for equity raising in the outside, but they extrapolate the same incentive problem that the bank has with the debt holders to the outside equity holders, with the difference that somehow outside equity holders will be expropriated, etc., etc. So to say it briefly, they consider outside equity raising as a possibility, but limited to a multiple of the inside equity. But then our story perfectly goes. So it's our stories about the inside equity. There could be a multiplier of that in the form of outside equity that helps comply with the capital requirements in the real world. But if out of a shock you lose a lot of the inside equity, it takes time for the inside equity to build up again and then to the outside equity to accompany. And I think this is pretty consistent with my causal reading of what is going on in the process of recapitalization of global banks. It's occurring, but it's occurring mainly through earnings retention, and we don't see huge changes in governance. Or if we see, it is special shareholders coming to the boards. So I think that there is this story to unfold. I'm sorry I cannot answer, given the time, the details. We can talk in private about calibration.
A break that I can pass on to David, maybe?
Sure. Just answering briefly your questions, Philip, on we do robust standard errors, you know, so our test results should hold and account for heteroscedasticity. Varying coefficients, we can do a regime change once in our period, and even that stresses our ability to identify coefficients because we have a lot of variables in there to account for global and local factors. So there's a limit to how much we can vary our coefficients outside just doing a pre-crisis and post-crisis regime. David asked me what are the sources of the variability. I have two risk measures, one that only uses the foreign exposures. And there, the main source of variability is the CDS spreads, which is why we really try to, for example, regress the CDS or our risk measure on the common factors first and look at residuals to make sure that we're really looking at movements in our risk measure that are not explained by common factors to see if that affects the bank CDS spreads, and it does. So in the other risk measure, I was looking for numbers, but there's more source of variability in the holdings in balance sheet movements, but I can't answer you exactly on the extent to which these things vary. Part of our motivation, by the way, Philip, for getting into this was that the domestic holdings of government bonds are pretty small compared to the foreign assets. Our average measure for foreign asset holdings across all countries is 38% of balance sheet, so a lot, larger than the holdings of domestic. So that would confirm the importance of your graph, and even make the last little increases small compared to foreign asset holdings. So it is a huge factor. I think those were the main points for my paper.
All right, I have a feeling as time goes along, more and more questions accumulate for me. So not to delay our effort to have our lunch, let me be quick. So first one, just now Philip asked me about the market-based data measure. First, there are a lot of information in the sense that the market charge to this kind of portfolio, not only according to the actual default risk, but also their risk aversion, different risk premium. So in order to calm the market, should the bank regulator really inject that much money into the system by taking into account a different risk premium, or just based purely on the EDF type of measure, the actual default risk? This is something we can discuss. The other one is the quick moving nature of this kind of market-based indicator. For our measure, it's updated weekly, and there is an even fast-moving measure, the S-risk, is updated daily by the risk lab in the NYSE. So all this market-based type of measure is very quick moving. We are sure that the macro fundamental may not be moving that quickly. So it's also at the regulator's discretion to determine how often to sample. The other one is the linearity. So in our second step of computation, we use correlation. This is for the ease of computation. Our simulation is quite heavy, so all the empirical results, especially the computation of DIP measure, I carry out in the supercomputer in the weather center hosted in University of Oklahoma. So it's already very time-consuming in nature. So we try to keep the computation as simple as possible. However, of course, the network approach or the other nonlinear type of approach will be more interesting and capture more aspect of the systemic risk for sure. And then the other one is from Javier, whether our systemic risk has certain type of predictive power or just the contemporaneous measure. So for sure, our measure is contemporaneous type of indicator. That is, when there is a risk, we signal it. How to predict it, we need to build a different type of time series model. And also, for this kind of series type of crash, I myself is a time series economist, have some doubt in the ability to forecast it. If forecast it, because there's this kind of concern, if we forecast it and the bank regulator carry out measurement which is effective, then basically we kill the systemic risk. And exposed, we will not observe the risk. And then the forecast will be false. But actually, the forecast is correct in the first place. So this is practically difficult to forecast it. And then the other one is the statement about European bank, which is banking system based instead of the market based. Which one is more risky? I haven't called my co-authors. They throw in this sentence in the paper. So that's why I didn't mention it in my talk. And I really need to hold a conference call and ask them their opinion, although one of our audience provided very good answer just now, and I thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So just to pick up the 2 points before we break for lunch, the speed versus the sustainability of signal about systemic event is of course a trade-off. And the problem is that if you see a pickup in the systemic risk contribution of an intermediary in 1 week, the question is which is large, what do you make out of it? So will it, at that very moment you have to decide, say, and you don't know whether in real time, whether it will continue for 3 or 4 more weeks, and so basically it's like a sustained development, or is something that is related to certain elements in the market dynamics that actually will go away the next week. So that's the trade-off. But we are also looking at these measures, it's very clear, but there is lots of other things you have to put in addition. On the Europe-US question is the question of, which was asked about risk is, and we should not, now the sovereign risk is Europe. Now we have the fiscal cliff coming up in the US, and the attention, the market always tends to focus at one issue at one time. So we just have to be careful at the global level that we are aware where the attention is, so it's can't be taken for granted. If you take the average debt levels in Europe compared to the US, or in Euro area compared to UK, US, Japan, the average in Europe is not bad. It's actually quite good. It's actually not worse. It's better, despite some outliers, and therefore we should be, in our surveillance, very careful to look at all countries that have large deficits and make sure that our policies contribute to calm around the globe. And with these words, I would close this session, and we can break for lunch. And I think the next session is going to start. Are we starting on time? Next session is at 2:30. Yeah, that's enough for an Italian lunch, I think. You want to make an announcement?
So, in the afternoon, as usual, we are going to have the parallel sessions in the Röntgen building, in the seminar rooms below the building. So we're going to move there together after the lunch. Thank you.